The Memoirs of Sergeant Bourgogne offer a personal account of his experiences during Napoleon's Russian campaign. He describes the harsh realities faced by the French soldiers. These are his words. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, the general came to me and said, with his Gascon accent, "Sergeant, leave a corporal and 4 men here in charge of my quarters and the few things I have left. Go back to the camp yourself and rejoin the regiment with your guard. We shall have our work cut out for us presently." To tell the truth, I was very much disgusted at this order. I do not mean that I was afraid of fighting, but I grudged the time lost for sleep terribly. When we got to the camp, preparations were already going on. Evidently, serious things were expected. I heard several men say that they hoped an end would at last be put to their sufferings, as they could struggle no longer. At 2 o'clock, we began to move forward. We formed into 3 columns, the Fusiliers Grenadiers, I was amongst them, and the Fusiliers Chasseurs in the center, the skirmishers and light companies on the right and left. The cold was as intense as ever. We had the greatest difficulty in walking across the fields as the snow was up to our knees. After half an hour of this, we found ourselves in the midst of the Russians. On our right was a long line of infantry, opening a murderous fire on us, their heavy cavalry on our left, made up of cuirassiers in white uniform with black cuirasses. They howled like wolves to excite each other, but did not dare to attack. The artillery was in the center, pouring grape shot on us. All this did not stop our career in the least. In spite of the firing and the number of our men who fell, we charged on into their camp, where we made frightful havoc with our bayonets, and the men who were stationed further off had now had time to arm themselves and come to their comrades' help. This they did by setting fire to their camp and the 2 villages near. We fought by the light of the fires. The columns on the right and left had passed us, and entered the enemy's camp at the 2 ends, whereas our column had taken the middle. I have omitted to say that, as the head of our column charged into the Russian camp, we passed several hundred Russians stretched on the snow. We believed them to be dead or dangerously wounded. These men now jumped up and fired on us from behind, so that we had to make a demi-tour to defend ourselves. Unluckily for them, a battalion in the rear came up behind, so that they were taken between 2 fires, and in 5 minutes not one was left alive. This was a stratagem the Russians often employed, but this time it was not successful. Poor Belloc was the first man we lost. He had foretold his death at Smolensk. A ball struck his head and killed him on the spot. He was a great favorite with us all, and in spite of the indifference we now felt about everything, we were really sorry to lose him. We went through the Russian camp and reached the village. We forced the enemy to throw a part of their artillery into a lake there, and then found that a great number of foot soldiers had filled the houses, which were partly in flames. We now fought desperately hand to hand. The slaughter was terrible, and each man fought by himself for himself. I found myself near our colonel, the oldest in France, who had been through the campaign in Egypt. A sapper was holding him up by the arm, and the adjutant Major Rostand was there too. We were close to a farmyard filled with Russians and blockaded by our men. They could retreat only by an entrance into a large courtyard close by a barrier. While this desultory fighting was going on, I saw a Russian officer on a white horse striking with the flat of his sword any of his men who tried to get away by jumping over the barrier and so effectually preventing his escape. He got possession of the passage, but just as he was preparing to jump to the other side, his horse fell under him, struck by a ball. The men were forced to defend themselves, and the fighting now grew desperate. By the lurid light of the fire, it was a dreadful scene of butchery, Russians and Frenchmen in utter confusion, shooting each other muzzle to muzzle. I tried to get at the Russian officer, who had now extricated himself from his horse and was trying to save himself by getting over the barrier, but a Russian soldier got in the way and fired at me. Probably only the priming caught fire, otherwise there would have been an end of me. But the man who had fired reloaded his musket calmly, thinking no doubt that I was dangerously wounded. The adjutant major, Roustan, ran to me and seizing me by the arm said, "My poor Bourgogne, are you wounded?" "No," I answered. "Then," he said, "don't miss him." That was what I meant also, and before the Russian had time to reload, I shot him through. Mortally wounded, he did not, however, fall at once, but reeled back, and glaring at me, fell over the officer's horse at the barrier. The adjutant major gave him a thrust with his sword. Just then, I found myself near the colonel, who was completely worn out and fit for nothing more. He was alone except for his supper. The adjutant major came up, his sword covered with blood, saying that to get back to the colonel, he had been forced to cut his way with the sword, and that he had a bayonet wound in his thigh. As he spoke, the sapper, who was supporting the colonel, was struck in the chest by a ball. The colonel instantly said, "Sapper, you are wounded." "Yes, sir," said the sapper, and taking the colonel's hand, he made him feel the hole the ball had made. "Then go back." The sapper replied that he was strong enough to stay and die with him if necessary. "And after all," said the adjutant major, "where could he go? In the midst of the enemy. We do not know where we are, and I can see that we shall have to wait here, fighting till daylight." We had indeed lost all idea of our locality, blinded by the glare from the fires. 5 minutes after the sapper had been wounded, the Russians, whom we had held, blockaded in the farm, seeing that they ran a chance of being burnt alive, offered to surrender. They sent a non-commissioned officer through a perfect storm of balls to make the proposal. The adjutant major therefore sent me with the order to stop firing. "Stop firing!" said one of our wounded men. "The others may stop, if they please, but as I am wounded and very likely dying, I shall go on as long as I have cartridges to fire with." He went on, therefore, sitting in the snow, all stained with his blood, and even asked for more cartridges when he had fired his own. The adjutant major, seeing that his orders were disregarded, came himself with a message from the colonel. But our men, now perfectly desperate, took no notice and still continued to fire. The Russians, seeing that there was no hope for them and probably having no more ammunition, tried to rush out altogether from the building where they were fast getting roasted, but our men forced them back. They made a second attempt, not being able to endure their position, but scarcely had a few of their number reached the yard, when the building collapsed on the rest, more than 40 of them perishing in the flames, and those in the yard being crushed as well. When this was over, we collected our wounded together and gathered around the colonel with loaded weapons, waiting for daybreak. All this time, the rattle of musket shots was going on continually round us, mingled with the groans of the wounded and the dying. There is nothing more terrible than a battle at night when often fatal mistakes take place. In this way, we waited for the light. As soon as it appeared, we looked about us and could see the result of the night's fighting. The whole ground we had been over was strewn with the wounded and dying. I saw the man who had tried to kill me, and who was not yet dead, so I placed him more comfortably away from the white horse near which he had fallen. All the houses in the village and the whole of the Russian camp were covered with half-burnt corpses. Monsieur Gillet had his leg broken by a ball and died a few days afterward. The sharpshooters and the light companies lost more men than we. During the morning, I met Captain Desbonnets, who came from my country and commanded the company in the guards. He was looking for me to see if I were all safe. He said he had lost a third of his company besides the sub-lieutenant and his sergeant major. After this bloody contest, the Russians abandoned their positions without going very far off, and we remained on the battlefield during the day and night of the 16th and 17th, keeping on the qui-vive, however, all the time, neither being able to rest a moment nor even to warm ourselves. During the day, while we were all talking together of our miserable discomfort and of the night's battle, the adjutant major Delettre came up. He was the worst man I have ever known, and the cruelest, doing wrong for the mere pleasure of doing it. He began to talk, and greatly to our surprise, seemed much troubled by Belloc's tragic death. "Poor Belloc," he said. "I'm very sorry I ever behaved badly to him." Just then a voice in my ear, what voice I never knew, said, "He will die very soon." Others heard it also. He seemed sincerely sorry for all his bad behavior to those under him, and especially to us non-commissioned officers. I do not think there was a man in the regiment who would not have rejoiced to see him carried off by a bullet. We called him Peter the Cruel. On the morning of the 17th, almost before it was light, we took up our firearms and, forming into columns, set out to take up our position by the side of the road, opposite to the field of battle. When we got there, we saw a part of the Russian army on a little hill in front of us, near a wood, and therefore deployed in a line fronting them. On our left and behind us was a ravine which crossed the road. This hollow sheltered all those near it. On our right were the Fusiliers Chasseurs, with the head of their regiment a gunshot from the town. In front of us, 250 yards off, was a regiment of the Young Guard, commanded by General Leron. Further still on the right were the old Grenadiers and Chasseurs. The whole was commanded by the Emperor himself on foot. Walking with firm steps, as if on a grand parade day, he placed himself in the midst of the field of battle, opposite the enemy's batteries. I was with two of my friends, Grandier and Lebout, behind Adjutant Major Delettre. We were within half range of the Russian artillery, and directly they caught sight of us. They opened fire. Adjutant Major Delettre was the first man to fall. A ball had taken off his legs, just above his knees and his long riding boots. He fell without a cry, nor did he utter one at all. He was leading his horse, the bridle on his right arm. We stopped. As he filled up the path we walked on. We were forced to stride over him to get on at all, and as I was next after him, I did so the first. I looked at him as I passed. His eyes were open, and his teeth chattered convulsively. I went nearer to listen. He raised his voice and said, "For God's sake, take my pistols and blow my brains out." No one dared do this service for him, and without answering we went on our way. Most luckily as it happened, for before we had gone 6 yards, a second discharge carried off 3 of our men behind us, killing the adjutant major. Directly afterwards, the Emperor arrived and we began fighting. The enemy made terrible havoc in our ranks with their artillery. We had only a few pieces to reply with, and some of them were soon dismounted. Our men died without moving, and until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we maintained this dreadful position. The Russians sent a part of their army to take up a position on the road beyond Krasnové and to cut off our retreat, but the Emperor anticipated them by sending a battalion of the Old Guard there. While we stood thus exposed to the enemy's fire, our number continually diminishing, we saw to our left the remainder of Marshal Davoust's army in the midst of a swarm of Cossacks calmly marching towards us. With them was the canteen man's cart containing his wife and children. A ball intended for us struck them, and we heard the woman's shrieks, but we could not tell whether one of them was killed or only wounded. Just then the Dutch grenadiers of the guard abandoned an important position, which the Russians instantly filled with their artillery and directed their fire against us. Our position after this was untenable. A regiment sent to recover the ground was forced to retire. Another moved forward as far as the foot of the batteries, but was stopped by a body of cuirassiers. It then retired to the left of the battery, forming into a square. The enemy's cavalry came onto the attack again, but were received by a heavy fire which killed a great many. A second charge was made and met with the same reception. A third charge, supported by grape shot, was successful. The regiment was overwhelmed. The enemy broke into the square and finished off the remainder with their swords. These poor fellows, nearly all very young, having their hands and feet mostly frostbitten, had no power to defend themselves and were absolutely massacred. We witnessed this scene without being able to help our comrades. 11 men only returned. The rest were all killed, wounded, or taken prisoners, driven by sword thrusts into a little wood opposite. The colonel himself, covered with wounds, was made prisoner with several other officers. I must not omit to say that as we were getting into order of battle, the colonel had given the word of command. Drapeau, guides généraux, sur la ligne. I was therefore guide general on the right of our regiment. But they omitted to give the order for our return, and as I made it a point of honor to remain at my post, there I stayed for more than an hour, holding the butt end of my musket in the air, and in spite of the bullets flying around me, I did not move. By 2 o'clock, we had lost a third of our men, but the Fusilier chasseurs were the worst off of all, as, being nearer to the town, they were exposed to a more deadly fire. For the last half hour, the Emperor had drawn back with the 1st Regiment of the Guard to the high road. We remained on the field alone, with a very few men from different corps, facing more than 50,000 of the enemy. Marshal Mortier then ordered us to retreat, and we began to move, drawing off at walking pace, as if we were on parade, the Russian artillery overwhelming us with grape shot all the while. We took with us the least dangerously wounded of our men. It was a terrible scene as we left the field, for when our poor wounded men saw that they were being abandoned, surrounded by the enemy, many of them dragged themselves painfully on their knees after us, staining the snow with their blood and raising their hands to heaven with heart-rending cries, imploring us to help them. But what could we do? The same fate was in store for us, for at every moment men fell from our ranks and were in their turn abandoned. I saw as I passed the position occupied by the Fusilier chasseurs several of my friends stretched dead on the snow, horribly mutilated by grape shot. A man named Capon from Bapaume was one of my best friends. After passing the Fusilier chasseurs, as we entered the town, we saw on our left some pieces of artillery firing at the Russian for our protection. They were served and supported by about 40 men, gunners and light infantry. All that was left of General Longchamp's brigade. He was there himself with the remnant of his men, determined to save them or die with them. As soon as he caught sight of our colonel, he came to him with open arms. They embraced as two friends who had not met for long, and who perhaps were never to meet again. The general, with his eyes full of tears, showed the 2 guns and the few remaining men to our colonel. "Look," he said, "that is all I have left." They had been through the Egyptian campaign together. After this battle, Kutuzov, the general-in-chief of the Russian army, was heard to say that the French, so far from being disheartened by their cruel sufferings, only rushed more madly on the guns that destroyed them. Wilson, the English general who was present at this battle, called it the hero's battle. The word ought to be applied to us and to us only, who, with a few thousand men, fought against the whole Russian force of 90,000. General Longchamp, with his poor remainder, was forced to leave his guns, all the horses being killed, and follow our retreat, taking advantage of what shelter he could find behind houses or banks as he went. We were scarcely within the town of Krasnoye when the Russians, their guns mounted on sledges, took up a position near the outlying houses and opened a fire of grape shot on us. 3 men of our company were wounded. A ball which grazed my musket and split the stock struck a young drummer on the head and killed him on the spot. The town of Krasnoye is divided in 2 by a deep hollow, which must be crossed. Arriving there, we saw at the bottom a herd of oxen, dead of cold and hunger. So stiff were they frozen that our sapper could scarcely cut them up with hatchets. Only their heads were visible,
their eyes still open, their bodies were covered with snow. These bullocks belonged to the army and had not been able to reach us. The extreme cold and want of fodder had killed them. A large convent in this wretched town, and all the houses were filled with wounded, who shrieked in despair when they heard they were to be left to the Russians. We were forced to leave them thus to a savage and brutal enemy, who stripped and robbed these unfortunate men without pity for their wounds or their condition. The Russians still followed us, but slowly, and they were unable to do us much harm. Our road was through a deep cutting, and the bullets passed over our heads. The cavalry on our right also prevented the enemy from coming to close quarters. At a quarter of a league's distance from the town, things grew quieter. We walked on sadly and silently, thinking of our dreadful situation and of our unfortunate comrades left in the hands of the enemy. I seemed still to hear them begging for help, and looking back, we could see some of the slightly wounded, already stripped almost naked by the Russians, and left in that condition. We were luckily able to save the poor fellows, at least for the time, and we spared all we could to cover them. That night, the Emperor slept at Liadui, a village built of wood. Our regiment camped a little further off. As I passed through the village, I stopped near a wretched hovel to warm myself at a fire. There I had the good fortune to meet Sergeant Guignard again, from my own village and his Hungarian cantiniere. They gave me a little oatmeal broth and some horseflesh. I was badly in need of the food, as I was shockingly weak, having eaten hardly anything for 2 days. The sergeant told me that their regiment had suffered considerably in the battle, and their numbers were much diminished, but not nearly as greatly as ours. That he had thought much of me, and was heartily glad to see me again with a whole skin. He asked me after Captain Debonnet, but I had not seen him since the 16th. I left him to go back to my regiment, encamped near the high road. We spent a dreadful night. There was a high wind, and half-melted snow was falling, which wetted us through, and we had very little fire. All this, however, was nothing compared to what we went through afterward. During this dreadful night, many of the sharpshooters came to warm themselves at our fire. I asked them for news of several of my friends, especially of 2 from my part who were in the Velite with me. One was Monsieur Alexandre Legrand, of the Quatre Fils Aymon at Valenciennes, and the other, Monsieur Laporte from Cassel, near Lille, had been killed by a grape shot. At midnight, one of our sentinels told me he could see a man on horseback appearing to come from our side. I ran at once with 2 of our men to see who it could be. I could distinguish the horseman perfectly, and in front of him a foot soldier whom he was apparently forcing on before him. When they got near us, I recognized a dragoon of the guard who had made his way into the Russian camp to get food for himself and his horse. He had disguised himself by means of the helmet of a Russian cuirassier whom he had killed the day before. He had brought away from the enemy's camp a bundle of straw and a little flour, and had wounded one sentinel and knocked down another, whom he made prisoner and brought along with him. This brave fellow was called Melee, and he came from Condé. He stayed with us for the rest of the night. He said that he had run this risk for his horse, called Cadet, and not for himself. At any cost, he had determined to get the animal some food. If I save my horse, he will save me afterward. This was the second time he had got inside the Russian camp since leaving Smolensk. On the first occasion, he had brought back a horse already harnessed. He was fortunate enough to return to France with his horse. They had already been through the Prussian and Polish campaigns of 1806-7 together, in Spain in 1808, in Germany in 1809, in Spain again 1810-11, and in Russia 1812, afterward in Saxony in 1813, and France 1814. The poor horse was finally killed at Waterloo, after being through more than 12 great battles commanded by the Emperor and over 30 smaller engagements. I met Melee again during this wretched campaign on a lake, breaking a hole in the ice with a hatchet to get water for his horse. And another time I saw him at the top of a burning barn in peril of his life, getting straw from the roof for him, for the horses were as badly off as we were. The poor animals had to gnaw at the trees to feed themselves, until in their turn they fed us. After this, others followed Melee's example and got into the Russian camp for provisions. Many of them were seized and died afterward. Our destitution was now so great that our men left their regiments at the least sign of a road in the faint hope of its leading to some village, if one can give that name to the collection of wretched hovels made out of tree trunks and containing absolutely nothing. I could never discover what these peasants lived on. Our men would come back sometimes, bringing bits of bread as black as coal and filled with long pieces of straw and grains of barley, so terribly hard that no teeth could bite into them. And besides, our lips were all split and cracked by frost. During all this miserable campaign, I never saw a man bring so much as a cow or a sheep with him. What these savages live on, no one can tell. They have no beasts, that is certain, or we should have seen some. It is the devil's own country, for it is hell all through. That concludes the 9th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.